The activity and prosperity of Marseille, both within and without, were rapidly developed. She carried her commerce wherever the Phoenicians and the Rhodians had marked out a road. She repaired their forts, she took to herself their establishments, and she placed on her medals, to signify dominion, the rose, the emblem of Rhodes, beside the lion of Marseille. But Nan, the Gaelic chieftain who had protected her infancy, died, and his son, Coman, shared the jealousy felt by the Segobrigians and the neighboring peoplets towards the newcomers. He promised and really resolved to destroy the new city. It was the time of the flowering of the vine, a season of great festivity amongst the Ionian Greeks, and Marseille thought solely of the preparations for the feast. The houses and public places were being decorated with branches and flowers. No guard was set, no work was done. Coman sent into the town a number of his men, some openly, as if to take part in the festivities. Others hidden at the bottom of the carts, which conveyed into Marseille the branches and foliage from the outskirts. He himself went and lay in ambush in a neighboring glen with 7,000 men, they say, but the number is probably exaggerated, and waited for his emissaries to open the gates to him during the night. But once more a woman, a near relation of the Gaelic chieftain, was the guardian angel of the Greeks, and revealed the plot to a young man of Marseille, with whom she was in love. The gates were immediately shut, and so many Segobrigians as happened to be in the town were massacred. Then, when night came on, the inhabitants, armed, went forth to surprise Coman in the ambush where he was awaiting the moment to surprise him, and there he fell with all his men. Delivered as they were from this danger, the Massilians, nevertheless, remained in a difficult and disquieting situation. The peoplets around, in coalition against them, attacked them often and threatened them incessantly. But whilst they were struggling against these embarrassments, a grand disaster happening in the very same spot whence they had emigrated half a century before was procuring them a great accession of strength and the surest means of defense. In the year 542 BC, Phocea succumbed beneath the efforts of Cyrus, king of Persia, and her inhabitants, leaving to the conqueror empty streets and deserted houses, took to their ships in a body, and her inhabitants, living in the year 542 BC, Phocea succumbed beneath the efforts of Cyrus, king of Persia, and her inhabitants, leaving to the conqueror empty streets and deserted houses, took to their ships in a body, to transfer their homes elsewhither. A portion of this floating population made straight for Marseille. Others stopped at Corsica in the harbor of Alalia, another Phocian colony. But at the end of 5 years, they too tired of prodigal life and of the incessant wars they had to sustain against the Carthaginians, quitted Corsica and went to rejoin their compatriots in Gaul. Thenceforward, Marseille found herself in a position to face her enemies. She extended her walls all round the bay and her enterprises far away. She founded on the southern coast of Gaul and on the eastern coast of Spain permanent settlements, which are to this day towns, eastward of the Rhone. Hercules' harbor, Monosios, Monaco, Nicaea, Nice, Antipolis, Antibes, westward, Heraclea, Cacabadia, St. Gilles, Agatha, Agde, Emporiae, Ampurias in Catalonia, etc., etc. In the valley of the Rhone, several towns of the Gauls, Cabello, Cavaillon, Avenio, Avignon, Arelate, Arles, for instance, were like Greek colonies. So great there was the number of travelers or established merchants who spoke Greek. With this commercial activity, Marseille united intellectual and scientific activity. Her grammarians were among the first to revise and annotate the poems of Homer, and bold travelers from Marseille, Eutymenes and Pythias, by name, cruised one along the western coast of Africa, beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, and the other the southern and western coasts of Europe, from the mouth of the Tanais, Don, in the Black Sea, to the latitudes and perhaps into the interior of the Baltic. They lived, both of them, in the second half of the 4th century, and they wrote each a periplus, or tales of their travels, which have unfortunately been almost entirely lost. But whatever may have been her intelligence and activity, a single town situated at the extremity of Gaul, and peopled with foreigners, could have but little influence over so vast a country and its inhabitants. At first, civilization is very hard and very slow. It requires many centuries, many great events, and many years of toil to overcome the early habits of a people, and cause them to exchange the pleasures, gross indeed, but accompanied with the idleness and freedom of barbarian life, for the toilful advantages of a regulated social condition. By dint of foresight, perseverance, and courage, the merchants of Marseille and her colonies crossed by 2 or 3 main lines the forests, morasses, and heaths through the savage tribes of Gauls, and there effected their exchanges. But to the right and left they penetrated but a short distance. Even on their main lines, their traces soon disappeared, and at the commercial settlements which they established here and there, they often far more occupied in self-defense. And at the commercial settlements which they established here and there, they were often far more occupied in self-defense than in spreading their example. Beyond a strip of land of uneven breadth along the Mediterranean, and save the space peopled towards the southwest by the Iberians, the country which received its name from the former of the two was occupied by the Gauls and the Kymrians. By the Gauls in the center, southeast, and east, in the highlands of modern France, between the Alps, the Vosges, the mountains of Auvergne, and the Cevennes. By the Kymrians in the north, northwest, and west in the lowlands, from the western boundary of the Gauls to the ocean. Whether the Gauls and the Kymrians were originally of the same race, or at least of races closely connected, whether they were both anciently comprised under the general name of Celts, and whether the Kymrians, if they were not of the same race as the Gauls, belonged to that of the Germans, the final conquerors of the Roman Empire, are questions which the learned have been a long, long while discussing without deciding. The only facts which seem to be clear and certain are the following. The ancients for a long while applied, without distinction, the name of Celts to the peoples who lived in the west and north of Europe, regardless of precise limits, language, or origin. It was a geographical title applicable to a vast but ill explored territory, rather than a real historical name of race or nation. And so, in the earliest times, Gauls, Germans, Bretons, and even Iberians appear frequently confounded under the name of Celts, peoples of Celtica. Little by little, this name is observed to become more restricted and more precise. The Iberians of Spain are the first to be detached, then the Germans. In the century preceding the Christian era, the Gauls, that is, the peoples inhabiting Gaul, are alone called Celts. We begin even to recognize amongst them diversities of race, and to distinguish the Iberians of Gauls, alias Aquitanians, and the Kymrians or Belgians from the Gauls, to whom the name of Celts is confined. Sometimes, even it is to a confederation of certain Gaelic tribes that the name specially applies. However it be, the Gauls appear to have been the first inhabitants of Western Europe. In the most ancient historical memorials they are found there, and not only in Gaul, but in Great Britain, in Ireland, and in the neighboring islets. In Gaul, after a long predominance, their race commingled with other races to form the French nation. But in this commingling, numerous traces of their language, monuments, manners, and names of persons and places survived and still exist, especially to the east and southeast in local customs and vernacular dialects. In Ireland, in the Highlands of Scotland, in the Hebrides and the Isle of Man, Gauls, Giles, still live under their primitive name. There we still have the Gaelic race and tongue, free if not from any change, at least from absorbent fusion. From the 7th to the 4th century BC, a new population spread over Gaul, not at once, but by a series of invasions, of which the two principal took place at the two extremes of that epoch. They called themselves Kymrians or Kymrians, whence the Romans made the Cimbrians, which recalls Cimmery or Cimmerians, the name of a people whom the Greeks placed on the western bank of the Black Sea and in the Cimmerian Peninsula, called to this day Crimea. During these irregular and successively repeated movements of wandering populations, it often happened that tribes of different races met, made terms, united, and finished by amalgamation under one name. All the peoples that successively invaded Europe, Gauls, Kymrians, Germans, belonged at first in Asia, whence they came, to a common stem. The diversity of their languages, traditions, and manners, great as it already was at the time of their appearance in the West, was the work of time and of the diverse circumstances in the midst of which they had lived. But there always remained amongst them traces of a primitive affinity, which allowed of a sudden and frequent comminglings amidst their tumultuous dispersion. The Kymrians who crossed the Rhine and flung themselves into northern Gaul towards the middle of the 4th century BC called themselves Bolg or Belg or Belgians, a name which indeed is given to them by Roman writers and which has remained that of the country they first invaded. They descended southwards to the banks of the Seine and the Marne. There they encountered the Kymrians of former invasions, who not only had spread over the country comprised between the Seine and the Loire, to the very heart of the peninsula bordered by the latter river, but had crossed the sea and occupied a portion of the large island opposite Gaul, crowding back the Gauls, who had preceded them, upon Ireland and the Highlands of Scotland. It was from one of these tribes and his chieftain, called Prid or Prydain, Brit or Britain, that Great Britain and Brittany in France received the name which they have kept. Each of these races, far from forming a single people bound to the same destiny and under the same chieftains, split into peoplets, more or less independent, who foregathered or separated according to the shifts of circumstances, and who pursued, each on their own account and at their own pleasure, their fortunes or their fancies. The Ibero-Aquitanians numbered 20 tribes, the Gauls 22 nations. The original Kymrians mingled with the Gauls between the Loire and the Garonne, 17, and the Kymro-Belgians, 23. These 62 nations were subdivided into several hundreds of tribes, and these petty agglomerations were distributed amongst rival confederations or leagues, which disputed one with another the supremacy over such and such a portion of territory. 3 grand leagues existed amongst the Gauls, that of the Arvernians, formed of peoplets established in the country, which received from them the name of Auvergne, that of the Edouans in Burgundy, whose center was Bibracte, Autun, and that of the Sequanians in Franche-Comté, whose center was Vesontio, Besançon. Amongst the Kymrians of the West, the Armoric League bound together the tribes of Brittany and Lower Normandy. From these alliances, intended to group together scattered forces, sprang fresh passions or interests, which became so many fresh causes of discord and hostility, and in these diverse agglomerations, government was everywhere almost equally irregular and powerless to maintain order or found an enduring state. Kymrians, Gauls, or Iberians were nearly equally ignorant, improvident, slaves to the shiftings of their ideas and the sway of their passions, fond of war and idleness, and rapine and feasting, of gross and savage pleasures. All gloried in hanging from the breast gear of their horses, or nailing to the doors of their houses the heads of their enemies. All sacrificed human victims to their gods. All tied their prisoners to trees and burned or flogged them to death. All took pleasure in wearing upon their heads or round their arms and depicting upon their naked bodies fantastic ornaments which gave them a wild appearance. An unbridled passion for wine and strong liquors was general amongst them. The traders of Italy, and especially of Marseille, brought supplies into every part of Gaul. From interval to interval, there were magazines established, whither the Gauls flocked to sell for a flask of wine their furs, their grain, their cattle, their slaves. It was easy, says an ancient historian, to get the Ganymede for the liquor. Such are the essential characteristics of barbaric life, as they have been and as they are still, and as they still are, at several points of our globe amongst people of the same grade in the scale of civilization. They existed in nearly an equal degree amongst the different races of ancient Gaul, whose resemblance was rendered much stronger thereby than their diversity in other respects by some of their customs, traditions, or ideas. In their case, too, there is no sign of those permanent demarcations, those rooted antipathies, and that impossibility of unity which are observable amongst peoples whose original moral condition is really very different. In Asia, Africa, and America, the English, the Dutch, the Spanish, and the French have been and are still in frequent contact with the natives of the country, Hindus, Malays, Negroes, and Indians, and in spite of this contact, the races have remained widely separated from one another. In ancient Gaul, not only did Gauls, Kymrians, and Iberians live frequently in alliance and almost intimacy, but they actually commingled and cohabited without scruple in the same territory. And so we find in the midst of the Iberians, towards the mouth of the Garonne, a Gaelic tribe, the Viviscan Biturigians, come from the neighborhood of Bourges, where the bulk of the nation was settled. They had been driven thither by one of the first invasions of the Kymrians and peaceably taken root there. Bordigala, afterwards Bordeaux, was the chief settlement of this tribe, and even then a trading place between the Mediterranean and the ocean. A little farther on towards the south, a Kymrian tribe, the Boyans, lived isolated from its race in the wastelands of the Iberians, extracting the resin from the pines which grew in that territory. To the southwest, in the country situated between the Garonne, the Eastern Pyrenees, the Cevennes, and the Rhone, two great tribes of Kymro-Belgians, the Volg, Volk, or Volks, Arecomican, and Tectosagian, came to settle towards the end of the 4th century BC in the midst of the Iberian and Gaelic peoplets. And there is nothing to show that the newcomers lived worse with their neighbors than the latter had previously lived together. It is evident that amongst all these peoplets, whatever may have been their diversity of origin, there was sufficient similitude of social condition and manners to make agreement a matter neither very difficult nor very long to accomplish. On the other hand, and as a natural consequence, it was precarious and often of short duration. Iberian, Gaelic, or Kymrian as they might be, these peoplets underwent frequent displacements, forced or voluntary, to escape from the attacks of a more powerful neighbor, to find new pasturage in consequence of internal dissension, or perhaps for the mere pleasure of warfare and running risks, and to be delivered from the tediousness of a monotonous life. From the earliest times to the 1st century before the Christian era, Gaul appears a prey to this incessant and disorderly movement of the population. They change settlement and neighborhood, disappear from one point and reappear at another, cross one another, avoid one another, absorb and are absorbed, and the movement was not confined within Gaul. The Gauls of every race went, sometimes in very numerous hordes, to seek far-away plunder and a settlement. Spain, Italy, Germany, Greece, Asia Minor, and Africa have been in turn the theater of those Gallic expeditions, which entailed long wars, grand displacements of peoples, and sometimes the formation of new nations. Let us make a slight acquaintance with the outer history of the Gauls, for it is well worth while to follow them a space upon their distant wanderings. We will then return to the soil of France and concern ourselves only with what has passed within her boundaries.